I say to young conductors often, they'll forgive you for many things. They won't forgive you for being mediocre. They won't forgive you if they're mediocre. They want to be good, or they wouldn't waste their time by being in the choir. No one says, sign me up for the worst choir. I heard Joe Flummerfelt, the great choral conductor of yesteryear, address this very subject. He said, when I see people who just sort of get mad, it's typically because they don't know how to fix the problem. And so if I knew how to fix the problem, then I would fix the problem and I wouldn't get mad. Again, going back to Solomonovich, he used to say, a good conductor has to know the sound he wants. He has to know how to get it. In other words, the pedagogy. And he has to have the charisma to get it.
So I came to meet you at UNT, where I was doing my doctorate in organ, and we had a few opportunities to collaborate. Since you had the big premier ensemble, then you could do some Anglican choral music with organ, and that, I have to say, that was a big highlight for me, playing the Howells Collegium Royale Te Deum and the Bainton And I Saw a New Heaven, which I have to say is that the greatest Anglican anthem ever written, or it's got to be in the top 10?
Yeah, it checks all the boxes. It has all the colors, all the feels, all the pomp, and yeah, ideal.
Indeed. I don't know what it is, but I won't lie. To me, and I know this is not this way in the university setting, and maybe this is totally anathema, but to me, like, up here is a cappella choral music, and then maybe right below, choir with organ, and at the same level, choir with orchestra,
Right.
And then way below the screen where you can't see, choir with piano. Is that totally anathema, or do you agree?
Well, I think you have a bit of a bias. I mean, when you think about the great body of repertoire of people like Johannes Brahms, for instance, in which the piano writing is so artfully done, and having written for the voice, certainly there is a great deal of literature in which the piano part is subpar. But, as a pianist myself, I can always sort of sense, in one little phrase, if the person who composed or arranged was a pianist or not. And I'm sure you can do that as an organist as well. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, but
yeah,
no,
there's a few good things out there with piano, but
I think you have an implicit bias toward the sacred and toward the organ and the a cappella singing, which I have no qualms with that. I just returned about a month ago from Europe with the UNT a cappella choir, and we lived into our name. People are always a little perplexed when you hear about the a cappella choir and you use an instrument of some sort, but it's just the name of the choir since the 1930s. But we made the decision to program all unaccompanied repertoire, and so all we needed was a pitch pipe or a person with perfect pitch, and we were good to go. And it certainly makes things a lot easier. As you know, so often the console is in another county from where the choir is going to be singing, and so that gets much more complicated on a tour. So, but I'm with you in it. Yeah.
What music did you do on the tour?
Well, that's a great question. We were singing primarily in a competition in Marktoberdorf, Germany, and we were awarded first prize, which was very rewarding. There were a lot of fine choirs there. And so we sang everything from, sort of European premieres written by my UNT colleague, Marcus Garrett, who wrote for us a beautiful setting of Veni Sancte Spiritus, which we sang at the National ACDA in Dallas earlier this year. We sang a number of spirituals. I try to find, aside from the repertoire for the competition, we sang, a Bruckner motet, the Os Justi, which is maybe my favorite of the whole set. Works of a lot of American composers. I find when you travel abroad, people want to hear, yes, they want to hear a little bit of their own, but they certainly want to hear American repertoire. So sort of the best of American unaccompanied repertoire of things like Lauridsen and others. And one thing that was particularly, I think, poignant is a beautiful setting by Stanford Scriven of the Christ the Apple Tree text. We all know the Emily Poston and love that, of course, but Scriven's setting is equally tender. And in fact, our very last performance, if you will, was for a morning service in Munich before we flew home, and we closed with that and held hands in the sort of Midwestern Lutheran tradition, and lots of tears in the choir. But it was a fabulous trip. Yeah.
Wow, interesting. That brings up the whole idea of American choral repertoire and American choral tradition.
Yeah.
There are different ways of approaching different vowels and in the different rep. So what's your overall methodology? Like, do you say neither or neither, or is there a, and similar thing with diphthongs in repertoire? Do you have one method?
I think I'm fairly methodical, but I'm also by nature an intuitive person. And that is to say that not every situation will call for exactly the same solution. And so I try to obviously prepare and to make those decisions ahead of time. So I'm not thinking on the singer's time, but rather I've processed, do I want an open vowel? Do I want a closed vowel? We're talking about American repertoire, but if it's English as opposed to American English, are there certain vowel modifications that I want to make? And if so, then what would the English equivalent be? In terms of American things, again, sort of intuitively, I would respond to that vowel is not quite aligning. Does it need to be more closed, more open? And I would simply demonstrate myself. In terms of the usage of diphthongs, which are certainly built into the English language, I think the rule of thumb is that the primary vowel, the initial vowel, is the one that you might give 97% of the duration of, and then the little shadow vowel, the second vowel, happens very quickly and right at the end and together. So take the word SKY, for instance, the word sky. Well, I'm a Texan, and so people would say sky with no vanish E at the end. But as a singer, you'd sustain sky, and then at the very end put the E on, so that the primary vowel is for beauty, and then the secondary vowel at the end is for understandability.
Right. Or if you're a country singer, you might sing skoy.
Well, yeah.
Skoy.
You certainly might.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I met Nigel Short one time, and he was very quick to say that sort of in contradistinction to a lot of other choirs, that he tried to get to the middle of the diphthong sooner. So that the middle of the diphthong was actually like in the middle of the note.
That's a very interesting artistic point.
Hey, hit that like button.
And, I often hear with solo singers, as you alluded to earlier, whether it's a country singer or pop singer, that they might shade a little more quickly to the diphthong, the second vowel, to color the word in a different way, because it does have a different emotional impact. So I think the real challenge then with an ensemble is to do it together. Mm-hmm. And so, you think about a word, maybe you could give me a good example.
Plight. I mean, I guess that's the same vowel, but
Yeah, plight, plight. Certainly that gives a different emotional impact than plight, which is just sort of uniformly off and on. So I think,
right.
the artistry lies in the gray area, but then doing it at the same time. And this is one of the things that I think, to a person who is gesturally gifted, there can be even the subtle nuances of those kinds of changes in the hands of the conductor.
So you would show within your hands where the diphthong would change. Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, that would be an unusual thing. It would be a cherry on top kind of thing. It wouldn't be something that I would do on a word by word by word by word basis.
If you did that, what would that look like?
Oh, I don't know. There was a slower motion to that than it was in just sort of a sigh, and then sort of just release. Um, but I do think it's a matter of taste and artistry. I think when I work with choirs, particularly in a sort of workshop, maybe you have 1 hour with them. What I try to do first of all is to uniformly line up the transition from the initial vowel and get it as clean and resonant as possible, and then to then change to the next vowel, whether a diphthong or just the next vowel in a word, uniformly quickly. But I also hear what you're saying in terms of the artistry of sometimes a slight glide from one into the other. Yeah. But I think you have to get people together first, and then you can sort of nuance it. Yeah.
Sure. And then the other question with regards to vowel and especially diphthongs is when you're dealing with like spirituals, or you're dealing with, William Billings or whatever,
Yeah.
then how much do you modify that to sound like, do you sing William Billings like Sacred Harp, where it's definitely not anything remotely resembling bel canto style voice singing, but it's that sort of guttural, all
Yes.
from the chest, all high laryngeal position, and you're not
Yeah.
trying to do proper vowels that are, perfectly attuned for the
Yes.
most overtones. And so how do you make that decision? Because I won't
Well,
lie, especially when it comes to spirituals,
yeah,
most of the time that non-black choirs sing spirituals, I hate it.
I understand. I understand.
Or spiritual arrangements. Most of the time I hate them. But, you know, with exception, but some of it, I think it's like if you're singing it like it's opera, it doesn't sound right. But
Right.
you could make the argument the other way, since like Mahalia Jackson was sort of like in between the classical world and the spiritual world. So she was kind of doing some of that,
Yes.
vocal modification. Anyway, I've talked too long. What do you think? What's
Well, I
your
think a general analogy is, the fact that, you can have a Stradivarius and you can play Mozart on it, or you can play, Turkey in the Straw with a different approach to the technique, right? I mean, you could have the same instrument and play with different stylistic inferences and different sounds in your ear, and so too with the human voice, in that there's this spectrum of the use of bright to dark and any particular vowel. There's the spectrum of vibrato from absolutely no audible vibrato. I mean, there's always a little bit of wiggle in the sound. Otherwise, there would be no phonation. I mean, because the vocal folds themselves have to move a little bit to make the sound, right? So what we would essentially say, from senza vibrato to full Wagnerian operatic singing, and so to have the flexibility to play with those kinds of variables to find what seems to be the most authentic sound. And our early music colleagues are always searching for what is the most authentic approach, and so too I think we do with whether it's a spiritual or an arrangement of a Dolly Parton song or something that you want to get to the most authentic. Now the challenge comes, I think, with younger singers, in the same way that it would be with younger players, and in an orchestra, is that while you're still building the basic technique of creating sound, at least in my world, one is creating sort of Western culture, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Brahms, right, approach to playing the instrument. And so the young string player is using vibrato, and the young singer is learning to make a tall vowel. And so when you vary from those things with a less experienced singers, it's sometimes a little more challenging. And with the more advanced singers, the singers with whom I work at University of North Texas, they can turn on a dime. And it's the only real limitation is my ability to articulate or model the sound that I want. I remember years ago with the college choir, before I came here, I was working something of, I think, Tallis. I couldn't quite get the right sound. So I played a 30-second recording of some great choir like the Tallis Scholars singing it. They had the sound in their ear. So for vocalists, it's more a matter of hearing what it is than us somehow talking it to death.
Yeah, even with my amateur church choir, I've experimented with, let's just let you listen to a really good recording of this once.
Right.
And then immediately they changed. I mean, it took at least 30-40% of my work away.
Absolutely.
They just started phrasing naturally because they had just heard the natural phrasing.
Absolutely. And then, and this is the whole fascinating process for me of the young musician, which we all were once, young musicians. People ask me for advice, and one of the pieces of advice I often give is to a young musician is to be around older and better musicians than you are. And there's this osmosis of, they sort of phrased they did something special with the comma there. They didn't take a breath, but they sort of shaped it a little differently. I had a lovely email maybe a week ago from a young woman here at the university who's only sung with me for 1 year, but now she's having an experience in another city, singing with a kind of a semi-pro choir for the summer. And she wrote me a very lovely note and talked about how much she'd learned and grown. And I think these are the kinds of things we're talking about, is this almost unteachable things. I suppose you could put it on a whiteboard and describe it. Like, okay, you're going to crescendo here slightly, you're going to decrescendo here. But so much of this is more caught than taught. It's like parenting. I know you're a young parent. So much of it is just caught, right? They see mom do this or dad do this and they imitate it. And so we're constantly role models for good or bad in all realms of life.
Right. How do you deal with stress? Do you freak out and start yelling, or do you just take a big deep breath and smile, and they'll start doing the same?
That's exactly right. There were many times when my wife would have to sort of dial me down and say, "Alan, if you'll just chill, then the kids will chill." So there's truth to that. Yeah.
How do you deal with the younger singers? So for example, I have the soprano, and when she was a freshman, I was warming her up just to see where her range was. And she went above, I think she went to the E flat under Queen of the Night F.
Yeah.
At 18. And she could also sing the C below middle C.
Wow.
I mean, just the most ridiculous range, And I know she's got a ton of vibrato, So I kind of don't want to mess with it. So I mostly have her sing alto because I don't want to tell her to cut the vibrato and then accidentally impose some sort of artificial, I've got to, unhealthy maneuvering, so that then she doesn't learn how to sing opera the way that her teacher is trying to teach her bel canto in Charleston,
Yes,
so I'm like, well, let's just mostly have her sing alto unless I have descants or a solo or something. And that way, if I want straight tone, I can ask the people who aren't in school anymore or who are like 27 or whatever, and they're a little more appropriate to it. Do you have a similar strategy, or what do you think of that strategy? Because it's got to be a difficult thing maintaining relationships with a bunch of opera teachers who want them to sing full voice and operatic all the time when you're trying to do Herbert Howells.
Well, this is a very important question, and I don't pretend to have the definitive answer. I can only say that I have I've tried to, in every situation in which I've worked, and in the churches in which I've served, it hasn't been so much of a conversation in that the singers aren't necessarily answering to someone else, a voice teacher or something. So, but particularly in the university setting, the college setting, those singers, and when I say young, I mean 18 to 25 or so. They're just beginning to sort out their technique and to align, as you've inferred, to align their technique with the the most essential fundamentals of steady breath management, and all the multiplicity of things that go into good singing. So there is this constant sort of relationship between compromise and pedagogy when it comes to helping the choir to healthfully realize the aesthetic that is in the conductor's ear. Okay. And so guys like you and I have a certain, well, all of us by default have some kind of sound in our ear. My mentor, Paul Solomonovich, used to say, Alan, there are two kind of choir directors. There are those who their choir sounds like the sort of amalgam of whoever happens to be in the room at the time. And then there are those choral conductors who have such a clear idea in their head of what it is they want. It doesn't matter really who's in front of them. That group of people is going to come closer and closer and closer to the sound in the conductor's ears. And so when I'm, working with my graduate conductors at North Texas, that's among the first conversations that we have, is this idea of evolving and developing one's aural image of what the sound is. Now, to go back to your question about singers, what's often interesting in an academic setting, you may have one year where there's 50% of turnover in the choir or more. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's a third, maybe a fourth. So what I often hear is that the people who've sung with me for a year or two have a certain default expectation of sound. And then the younger people come in, and the first couple of weeks, you'll hear individuals sort of sticking out of the fabric. And then over time, these sensitive young musicians begin to intuitively come into the fold of the sound, right? And whether that is vowel modification, whether that's a little more mindfulness about the vibrato being intentionally to center the pitch, it begins to evolve. So, as I go into year 10 at UNT, it's not that often that I have to say less vibrato or no obvious vibrato, that kind of thing. They tend to sort of come into the sound. Occasionally I might take my hand, and this is a Solomonovich thing, and just while they're sustaining the pitch, I might move it horizontally. And what I find is they begin to steady the pitch. So, I had a very interesting moment when we were singing in Europe, and a brilliant young man came up to me, and he was talking about what he'd heard in my choir, and he asked, do I use specific tuning exercises? The inference was the choir was in tune. Maybe that's not the American reputation, I don't know. But, and I said, no, not really. No, I said I work at tuning a lot, stopping and holding chords and aligning and talking about the relationship between octave and fifths and thirds, as all of us do. But in terms of exercises, not so much. So my own way of working is not to do a whole battery of exercises so much at the beginning, though we do have a maybe 3-minute warm-up or something, but is to use the literature itself to find moments to tune, whether that's matching the vowel or the vibrato rate coming close to each other, that kind of thing.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Would you please consider supporting me on Patreon? I'm really enjoying making this podcast as a means of having interesting conversations with people in the arts and those who are interested in promoting beauty, especially in the liturgical arts. But I'm also doing this as a means of trying to help support my family. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting me on Patreon, it would mean the world to me. The first 20 people in the United States who sign up at any financial level, be that the $5 level or above, will get a free copy of my CD, Bach's Organ Mass, recorded on the Trost organ in Waltershausen. Thank you for your support. When it comes to tuning, do you have specific preferences? For example, some choir directors like the thirds to be sharper and some like them to be minor. I know if you're in barber shop, for example, like a perfectly tuned third, if I believe, like major third, that is 13-cent flat. But at least with the amateur choir, if I tell them, make it a little flat, then I have a minor third. So I never tell them, but if I had tenebrae in front of me, then maybe
Right.
I would try to let's just ever so slightly diminish that third, you know.
Right.
So do you have a preference?
Again, going back to my intuitive orientation as opposed to the scientific. I grew up in the band world. I was a French horn player,
Oh,
uh,
I didn't know that.
which I started in the sixth grade doing that. I mean, keyboard was my first entry into music. My grandmother figured out that I wasn't going to be a star football player in our local school, so she said, "Alan, why don't you take piano lessons?" And so I started, at about 9 or 10 or something, taking piano, and then it seemed the thing to do to join band. And so I played French horn, and then I was recruited into choir because I had keyboard skills, not because I could sing necessarily, going into the eighth grade. So, when you talk about tuning and you talk about thirds, my first experience was in bands. And so, yes, I hear what you're saying in terms of some thirds adjusting slightly lower, but it's always been my experience that with choirs, major thirds, I use the word a brighter third, a slightly higher third. Now, it is a location situation, and there might be a particular reason why you wouldn't want it to be necessarily on the high side, but I would say those moments are few and far between in my experience.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably the issue when you're dealing with a choir is that this is just my guess, is that
Yeah.
if you start trying to like make the third a little bit lower and they're not just the super top-notch ears, then some of the intervals afterward will be lower, and so then you
Right.
just have this horrible, now they've shifted the pitch. Where I think
Yes.
some of this super intricacy might come into play, like if you knew it, and granted, it's like almost no one needs this, but for
Yeah.
example, like at Christchurch Plano, they were trying to do the was it the Purcell? Was it "Hear My Prayer, O Lord," or is it "Remember Not Our Offenses"?
Mm.
Remember, yeah, that one, which is one of the most beautiful, anthems ever, with that lovely, was it 9/8 6/5 suspension, or is it? It's like a 9/8 and a 4/3 suspension, I think is what it is. It's like a double suspension towards the end.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so gorgeous. But anyway, at one point, these who are, some of the best paid, best singing,
Yeah.
most professional, most of them have DMAs and vocal,
Yes.
they're struggling with a little bit of intonation towards the middle. And I thought,
Okay.
wow, that's like, these are top-notch singers. They shouldn't be struggling with pitch. But I wondered, if you're just dealing with just intonation, the pure mathematics of it, I think that some modulations, right? If you don't use the correct note to tune everything to, that if some of the higher pitches, it's like they were in tune, but they still drifted. And I don't think it was because of their singing necessarily. I think it was because of the intrinsic problems of trying to sing with just intonation and trying to transpose at the same time. And so if you were super nerdy and super mathematical, I think you could figure out which pivot notes you could
Yes.
use through the modulation and have
Right.
those imperceptibly go sharp.
Yes.
And you could be able to tell, like, the bass and the tenor, or the alto and the tenor, okay, I need these to go slightly sharp at the modulation, and then it would have stayed in tune. But, who all is listening for this, I don't know. That's sort of the... But that, to me, I think is probably the only real benefit you could have of just knowing the dominant seventh should be 31 cent flat, and
Yes.
the fifth should be 2 cent sharp, and that sort of thing.
Well, these are certainly the problems of the 1% in terms of
Yeah.
vocal music, and so I'm not sure how down the rabbit hole we want to go for your listeners, but obviously, even as you think about the keyboard, the D sharp, that's the leading tone in E major, is a little different than the E flat, that's the fifth of A flat major, right? And so
for sure.
that series of compromises that is the piano. But singers do have the capacity to make something 6 cents sharper or flatter. So I guess it would be the really highly skilled choral conductor who has a certain vocal sensitivity to know that at certain places to be slightly on the higher or slightly on the lower side. Much of that, in my own day-to-day experience, however, is more easily adjusted through vowel modification. That is to say, could we sing this a little brighter? And then all of a sudden you hear a chord ring, whereas before everybody was singing a slightly darker vowel, and there was a slight muffling effect to the sound. Now, this will take us in a slightly different journey, but I'm of an age in which, when I think about, let's say, 25, 30 years ago, the American choral culture in general tended to pivot to a darker sound is a better sound, right? I mean, you go back, let's say 60, 70 years, and you listen to the Westminster Choir of John Finley Wilkinson. You listen to, these hallmark choirs that sort of set the tone in the American choral sound. And it was generally sort of dark of center. And then I think with the proliferation of recordings that we've had since sort of John Rutter in the 1980s forward, we have more international influences, which I want to think the American sound has generally moved a little brighter. And you being in the sort of Anglican world, certainly that repertoire is built toward a slightly brighter approach to the English language. So all that to say, oftentimes we can get chords to ring, not so much by saying, if you were a wind player, push out or pull in, or if you were a string player, to adjust your finger slightly up or down, or for the singer to 6 set sharp or flat, is just to modify the vowel in such a way that the harmonic series amplifies the high as opposed to the low, bright versus dark on a spectrum. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And another thing that you talked about having an aural image, that you have a really strong aural image, and so people just kind of naturally fall into this.
Yes.
It seems like you're saying that's one of your high values, but my question would be, is there potentially trade-offs? Is there some legitimacy or value to having a choir director who says, "Ooh, I want to discover the sound of these singers, and I'm not going to, for lack of a better term, impose my aural image upon them, but I'm going to discover what they have." And I would say probably the people that do that the most are probably not the best choir conductors, but it could be that there's some really fabulous, phenomenal choir directors who have that paradigm for whatever reason. So what do you think of that? Is there trade-offs one way or the other?
Okay, this is a big question. I'm pleased to camp out here for a minute. Some of what choir directors do is, and I'm not saying this as a good or bad, I'm just saying this as an analysis over my life in this world, is a bit of I'm going to say the right thing because it's politically more acceptable to do so. What I mean by that is, affirming that we want people to sing their quote unquote natural sound. Well, yes, of course, we want the very best of what each individual singer brings. My teacher, Don Newen, used to sort of phrase it as, you come to the choir as a soloist. Now, what do you mean by that? That means that you bring the intensity of diction that a soloist singing an oratorio would bring. You bring the commitment to the energy of the line, of the breath stream that a soloist. So there is that mindset that, we're not asking for you to just be a cog in the wheel who's mindless and brings nothing of your personality to the sound. Okay. So that said, however, I think because the human voice is so immediately responsive to subtle changes, if we as the conductor don't have a clear aural image and an ever-evolving, winsome and clear way of helping people understand what it is we're asking for, then what we end up with is not people's very best as individuals, but guesswork on the part of the singers, right? And so my moments of frustration in rehearsal with myself are when I might find that I'm, dealing with a 22-year-old soprano who just wants to know what I want and how to achieve it, right? And so sometimes I know what I want more than I know how to achieve it in a 22-year-old soprano's voice. And so part of our responsibility as choir conductors is to be, all throughout our whole careers, becoming more deeply knowledgeable about how to help them facilitate that, right? And
Mm.
so I would think that, 75% of what I'm doing in any given rehearsal is affirming what they're learning in the studio in terms of breath and resonance and vowel and articulation of the text and those kinds of things. That's 75% of what we're doing is building the instrument rehearsal by rehearsal, the individual instrument affirming, and then the corporate instrument as well. And then maybe 25% is the influence of I think I'd like to close that vowel. I think I'd like less vibrato. I think I'd like brighter here, that kind of thing. A little less soprano, a little more bass. I think of that as more 25%. But, and that's why when I have someone who's come through the program who is primarily a keyboard person or whatever, I'm always insistent that they must become more and more of a student of the human voice, right? In the same way that I might feel somewhat more limited than an experienced cellist when I'm working with an orchestra. I know what I want musically, but translating that into their vernacular, there's where the rubber meets the road, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I could imagine, I think I agree with you. I think I
Yeah.
at least 80, 90% agree with you.
Okay. Yeah.
But I could also imagine it's like going to an organ, going
Yeah.
to a totally different organ,
Yes.
It's like, it's one thing if you're creating the sound because you're selecting the singers,
Right.
or,
Right.
and it's another thing like, oh, this is my group of volunteers. And so I
Yes.
could imagine playing an organ that just has a ridiculously beautiful open flute. And it's
Right.
like, I'm going to find a way to use that open flute.
Absolutely.
And it'd probably be the same with the choir. It's like, these tenors aren't so great. So we are going to bring back the volume on the tenors, and I'm going to tune it slightly differently to get a different sound. Or these tenors are super brassy. So maybe I'll bring out a little bit of the brassiness of the tenors. So,
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, those conductors who have the privilege of shaping their instrument based on the audition process, um, I think about my time in the Midwest, and certainly in the Lutheran tradition, let's say you have, 500 kids in the program, and you're going to take the 70 that you want, then you're going to choose the sopranos consistently that have the sound that you already want. Okay. And so 3/4 of your work is done by populating the choir with the voices that meet your intrinsic tonal values. Okay.
Right.
So, so you're going to go to the Steinway dealership and you're going to play 17 different Steinways, and you're going to choose one intuitively, not based on a mathematical equation, but this one feels right. And so when you hear a human voice, you're like, okay, I like the properties of the timbre of that sound, the flexibility. There are certain criterion, but to some degree, it's a little more intuitive. Now, in the situations in which I would find myself guest conducting or in an all-volunteer kind of choir, this is where the pedagogue in me is then challenged and empowered, right? How do I, number one, help these people to sing in the most healthy way, the most productive way? And again, that goes back to those just fundamental things of breath and vowel and alignment of the body and those kinds of things. So I have to be a good teacher first to just get the 6th grade kid to hold their instrument right, and the violinist, and the same thing with the volunteer singer. As people who use this little noodle in our throats 12, 16 hours a day, so we're speaking far more than we're singing, right? And so intrinsic in the challenge that many people have in terms of approximating what we would call, in the vernacular, a classical approach to singing, is that aspects of their speaking voice are a long way from the singing voice. Now, I always find it very interesting when there's a singer that speaks in a certain way, in a shallow sort of way, and then they open their mouth and they blow you away with the resonance of the singing voice. But I would say that's a little more of a rarity.
Okay, I see. And speaking of working with amateurs, the question that I think plagues every choir director that's ever existed and that's worked in a church is, what do you do with the old lady wobble?
Well, number one, I don't think there's a perfect answer. And, because you framed this specifically in the context of the church, I'll speak to my own opinion. And, again, you may disagree with some aspects and your listeners may disagree. That's fine. One opinion's as good as another. First of all, I think the role of the church musician is to be a pastoral presence. And so, there's a great deal of compromising here and making changes over time in a way that brings people along with you. In other words, if I'm advising a 30-year-old person who's going to have their first big church job or first college job or whatever, I always season my advice with go slowly and get to know your people and build relationships before you start making significant changes and irritating people in a way that is not helpful in the long term. Okay, that said, the church I serve in Frisco, Texas, and I'm not the director of music, I'm on the staff, and I assist in lots of different ways. I recommended about, a year ago that we revoice all the women in the choir. And that had to do specifically with the fact that there were problems in the soprano section that I felt like if we could convince a portion of these women to sing alto, that in the average rehearsal, we would stop, 30% less often to have to address things because people were singing in a part of their voice that was no longer flexible, right? And so we went through that process and we asked a number of women on our staff who are good singers to go through that process with the women. And I think the end result is that the choir's better. Let me just pick a number out of the sky. Let's say there were 50 women involved in the process. Could have been more, I don't know. I would say there were probably 5 who were very unhappy about the process. And there were, 30 who were okay with the process. And then I've lost track of my numbers here, but a few.
You're up to 35 out of 50. So 15
okay.
is the remaining.
And 15 who thought, oh, the choir sounds so much better now, right? Because people weren't being constantly asked to sing in a part of their voice that was no longer functional. Okay. And so, but here's the thing about singing, it's like our complexion or our hair. It's part of us. It's not, the oboist who gets a bad sound. What do? They hold the oboe out and they look at the reed, implying to the world, it wasn't my fault. It was the oboe reed fault. The singer, it's in our bodies. And so it's intrinsically tied to our emotional sense of self more than an external instrument. You as an organist can blame it on something inside the pipes or whatever, right? So we have to handle it with a different level of care. And so I think having a clear understanding of the mission of the choir is super, super important. And so the choirs that I work with in North Texas, from a choir that is essentially made up of people for whom singing is not their future career, they just want to sing in a choir. That's a different mission as compared with the most advanced choirs at the university, where these people are almost all music majors. And so the artistic understanding has to challenge them differently to the volunteer church choir, community choir. It's a different mission. So again, what I find is that I have to be a better teacher every day, and I have to be a more thoughtful diplomat in the way I go about achieving the artistic goals. I say to young conductors often, they'll forgive you for many things. They won't forgive you for being mediocre. They won't forgive you if they're mediocre. They want to be good, or they wouldn't waste their time by being in the choir. No one says, sign me up for the worst choir.
It is amazing how much people put up with because they want to be good.
It's true.
Like, they'll put up with horribly, and I've seen it over and over again. Not you, I must say, but horribly mean conductors.
Yeah.
But they still love it. They love singing in the choir. They want to get better. They trust the conductor, even if the conductor is just yelling at them and screaming at them. Now, ultimately, I think all this nonsense. You can get the same result by just...
Right.
You can just matter of fact say, that didn't sound good. Let's do that again.
You
you
know,
don't have to get mad at them because it didn't sound good. And then you're
right,
like, still didn't sound good. I think it needs a little more of this,
right,
you
right.
know? And
Okay,
then, hey, that sounded great. Good job, everyone. And then they feel good. You know, it's like
absolutely.
you don't just have to yell at them and be mad that they couldn't, you know, come up with whatever you had in your head. So anyway, that's not a diatribe towards you. It's just it does always like irk me when I see choir conductors, especially with volunteer choirs, who are just
Yes,
mean to them. It's so
yes.
horrible.
Well, a couple of things. Um, they often say, let's say someone's in their 60s, 70s, conductor. Oh, Dr. So and so, he's really mellowed. You should have had him back in the day. He'd throw chairs at you. I think what people perceive as someone mellowed really means that they matured emotionally, hopefully, but then they also maybe got better at facilitating, helping the singer produce the sound that they were after. It's not that the standard went down necessarily, but that they found a more winsome way to achieve the goal. And they, through trial and error, got better at explaining how to do what it is that they wanted to do. Sometimes, and I know you're a keyboard person primarily, but very intuitive about all things vocal and passionate about it yourself. Uh, you know, Surely in 25 years, you're going to be better at working with the choir than you are today. Again, through trial and error. I heard Joe Flummerfelt, the great choral conductor of yesteryear, address this very subject. He said, it's when I see people who just sort of get mad, it's typically because they don't know how to fix the problem. And so if I knew how to fix the problem, then I would fix the problem and I wouldn't get mad. Now, there are certainly occasions in which you're working with a group of people in which some of the people don't want to be there, or they're distracted, or they're in adolescence and can't focus more than 3 seconds or whatever. And so you've got to know the animal. And so, but yeah, I would boil it mostly down to knowing how to, as a pedagogically, get the sound that you want. Again, going back to Solomunovich, he used to say a good conductor has to know the sound he wants, and he has to know how to get it. In other words, the pedagogy, and he has to have the charisma to get it. Those three things: know what you want, know how to get it, and have the charisma to get it. Because a person can be brilliant
part
and not have the intensity, the sixth, the extra thing to get it. And so you may have a very intuitive, I've used that word a lot today, but a charismatic, gifted person who really doesn't know what they're doing, but somehow they get better results through personality than a person who does know what they're doing. I've spent a lot of time this summer reading interviews with the famous conductors of yesteryear, et cetera. And it's been interesting to me. I mean, there was a great quote of George Schulte. Again, this is taking us in a slightly different direction, and when he was talking about Sir George, talking about what does it take to make a great music director in an orchestra versus a great guest conductor, right? Same thing in the choir world. There is in the choir world, it seems to me, a lot of people who are, and this will sound a little critical, so warning to your listeners, who are great weekend warriors, great 2-day maestros who can go and fire up a group of people, and after 2 days, everyone's had a mountaintop experience and they have a great concert. And that's a skill set some are very intuitive about, and some of us sort of have to learn. And then there are those people like Schulte was talking about, music directors of orchestras, whose excellence is really found in the day to day in building the instrument and building the choir. And there are people sort of at the ends of the spectrum, and then most of us are somewhere sort of in the middle. But there are different skill sets.
Do you think one was better than the other, or do we need both?
Well, it really depends on what you're looking for. I've been privileged over this sort of long life in choral music to see the gamut. And I suppose I'm interested in the long haul. I'm interested in being a choir builder. Like we talk about, they're orchestral conductors who are orchestra builders. They may not have the most flamboyant personality, but concert by concert, day by day, year by year, they're building the sound, they're building the choir, they're building the technique, they're building the musicians. And for me, that's the higher call.
Sure. Now, when you're dealing with amateurs, do you have any tips to get them to sight read better?
That's a good question. You know, in my own situation right now, we have an outstanding, when I speak of my church, we have an outstanding children's choir program. And for the last year, I've been leading the high school youth choir. We have about 90 students enrolled for the fall, which is very exciting and
Dang.
very unusual, you know. And one of the things that I've observed is that in our situation, which is a dream situation, there is a bit of a divergence from the process of the younger choirs and how they're learning music. And what do we have? An hour 15 rehearsal once a week. I mean, we're all doing the best we can in our local situations. And then they come to me, and there's a very wide span of reading skills within these high school students. And so one of the things I'm thinking about and talking with my colleagues about is how can we begin to bridge that gap such that, you know, maybe in the children's choir, you know, maybe there's 5 minutes of musical literacy as part of the learning the songs and the spiritual nurture that's a part of it in the context of a church structure. I guess what I would say is there's not much to say to the volunteer singers as much as there is to say to the choir directors, as, you know, how can I build in my limited time, you know, from the beginning of the fall to Christmas, what can I do on a weekly basis to help people understand rhythmic notation better? Maybe set a very direct goal, right? And so maybe I have a sheet that we look at for 3 minutes in a rehearsal, and we're saying ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, or whatever system you want to use. Or maybe I'm rehearsing in such a way that I'm helping develop people's sense of rhythmic notation. And the same thing with reading pitch. You know, maybe I take a moment and I say, okay, choir, let's all look at the soprano line, and I want us to say together the names of the note. C, D, E, F sharp. But I think what often happens for those of us who are working with volunteer choirs is we just sort of take them where they are at age 35, and at 65, they're no better off in terms of their skill set. And I don't think it has to be a crash course of an hour theory lesson. No one's really interested in that in the choir setting. But, you know, setting short-term goals of this is what I want to get my people to get better at. And then maybe the spring is a different goal. That's just an off-the-cuff thought.
No, that's good, especially dividing it between rhythmic and notes. You know, that's a great way to do it. Or, you know, you could do this for this season. We're just gonna do rhythm, and this season we're gonna do a little solfege. You know, and then just kind of start building the skills over time.
I think the great fault is in the, and I say this as part of the crew. Is the fault of the thoughtful pedagogy of the director more than it is the ability of the people standing in front of us. I mean, you're going to have an engineer in your choir, in your volunteer choir, you know, who understands so many things that are more complicated than anything we do. All right. You know, a person who was a math major, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that they can't understand.
Depends on what level you do it to.
Right. Can we take them where they are? Can we take them where they are and have just little review sheets of fundamental things that we take just a couple of minutes on, and we help them along? Or maybe, you know, again, maybe as a church musician, you say, okay, I'm going to take 3 Saturdays over the course of the semester of the fall, and from, you know, 8:30 to 10:30, come whoever wants, and we're going to work on some music theory, and we're going to get better. You know, going back to the and you know, maybe 15 people will show up out of your choir. Or 5, but it'll get a little bit better. It'll be worth your time. You know, when I separated the two ideas of rhythmic notation versus pitch, that really goes back to my exposure to the Kodai approach, generally speaking, in which, you know, when I was in a elementary music education class, always notation was done with rhythm first. So you might hear someone go, and so you just do like a quarter stem, 2 eighth notes, and a quarter stem before you were worried about what the pitch was. So often I think we go into, even as a music major, freshman theory, you know, people are teaching musicianship skills like we have all this background, and we don't necessarily have all this background. But the key is to teach it like you would teach very bright young children, and to build a structure of understanding of notation and not assume that people have that.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's good. When it comes to gesture, who
Yeah.
are the biggest influences that you've had on gesture?
Yeah, that's very easy for me because I really think about these people and their influence on me. And I would put them in two categories. The first category are people that I actually studied with, that I actually had face-to-face time in a class setting or a private lesson. And then people whom I've respected, and therefore I've observed them at work and have sort of absorbed through osmosis or imitation things that have served me well. And then thirdly, I'd say that for the choir conductor, the orchestra conductor, wind conductor, whatever, ultimately the ensemble in front of you is going to be your best teacher. That is to say, something didn't work. Before I correct them, maybe I need to make some level of modification in my own physicality of working. Okay, so that said, and I can do this really quickly. My first conducting teachers as an undergraduate, a woman named Carol Smith and a gentleman named Bev, or BR, Beverly Ray Hinson. Okay, Carol was an orchestra conductor who had come out of the choral ranks and had a profound influence on me. I won't go into the specifics of that. Bev Hinson was my undergraduate choral conductor, who was a very gifted conductor gesturally and unusual for his generation, almost always conducted with a baton. And so all of my undergraduate training as a choral conducting person was with baton. And I'm very grateful for that because so often conductors even get through graduate school, choral conductors, and don't have very good stick technique. And that's just an observation. So with Bev Hinson, it was all about sort of the mechanics of the idea that we have these different hinges of the shoulder and the elbow and the wrist, and then I would add a fourth, which is to say the way the fingers can move independently, right? And so as we coordinate these movements, we're mindful in the beginning stages that really all I need is the activity of the wrist, or the gesture could emanate from the elbow out, or if something is really big, or I'm working to particularly engender lots of breath, maybe it begins at this upper hinge, but that I don't want to use more machinery than is necessary to become more efficient in my gestures, right? Okay, so that was
So
really
overall economy came from her.
Economy of gesture. That's right. For many reasons, the fact that once I've overstated things gesturally, I've given up my ability to influence to some degree because they know everything that I've got, right? I've given it away. It's like a person.
Isn't that true in everything?
Like a person
Not
who talks,
everything can be a catastrophe.
Not everything can be a catastrophe. So that was the influence from Bev Hinson, and I would say my initial sort of ages 17 through 22 as a young college student, he was a very, very musical person. And so my whole sort of intuitions about the rise and fall of a line and, subtleties of shaping text, strong and weak syllables, and those kinds of things were very influential by Bev Hinson. And so I'm very grateful for that. And then I went directly to the Eastman School of Music to work with Don Newen. I'd seen him work in some different guest conducting capacities. Charismatic, energetic. And your listeners who will know of Don Newen and his work through Eastman and through UCLA and through the Crystal Cathedral. He had the Crystal Cathedral Choir in Southern California for years. Very dynamic personality. Also a very fine conducting teacher. His approach was also what I might say fairly instrumental stick technique for a choral conductor. And so really up through my master's degree, I'd never really worked with anyone who was just a sort of a hands person. And then I encountered Joe Flummerfelt really through summer workshops at Westminster Choir College in the old days, when you'd go and spend a week working with different people. And again, this idea of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And so Flummerfelt, whom we lost in 2019, was maybe the most intuitive choral musician with whom I've ever worked. And he had a way of using his body that was not so pre-programmed as to, do this with your elbow and this with your wrist, but was much more about connecting what the conductor did physically to the processes of the singer creating the sound. And so he was able to have, with the subtlest changes of his body, an influence on the sound and the production of the sound and the color of the sound in ways that weren't textbook. And it's hard to go into that in just a little talk, but we can think of conducting the music, or we can think of conducting the singer within the context of what we're talking about as choral. And in a way, he conducted the music definitely, but he also influenced the singer. And then I would say then my fourth great influence was Paul Salamunovich. When I was choosing where to go for my doctorate, I had several choices, and I chose to go to UCLA to work with Don Nguyen, but also because I had an opportunity to be an intern with the LA Master Chorale during the Salamunovich years. Salamunovich was a church musician who also worked with professionals in every kind of setting, had a children's choir of his local Catholic parish, and could teach children well. Paul, his sound was rooted in his shaping, rooted in Gregorian chant understanding, of which I am certainly no expert. But if you listen to the recordings of Salamunovich and this sort of shaping undulation of line, and recording of even very modern works like the music of Morton Lauridsen, with whom he worked closely, you hear this subtlety of vocal inflection that was profoundly influenced by his constant practice of Gregorian chant. So those are the people who influenced me the most. Yeah.
And as far as orchestral conductors that you aspire to, well, those are, you said there were two groups. You said there were those who influenced you directly.
Yes.
Right. And then I'm assuming the other group, which maybe this is also, maybe there's some orchestral conductors in there as well, who didn't influence you directly via teaching,
right,
but through just looking up to and listening to and watching. So who might those be?
Well, even just quickly pivoting back to the other group, certainly Bev Hinson and Don Nguyen were the people I did my degrees with and actually had lessons with. Joe Flummerfelt, Paul Salamunovich, I sang in choirs with and observed, and maybe with Joe did some master classes where he would say a few things. But, in the old days, I was not shy about saying, could I videotape your rehearsal? And so I have hours of all these men in rehearsal. And so over the years of just watching 30 minutes here or there, reminded of these things. So they were, the latter, Salamunovich and Flummerfelt, were really more just the osmosis learning. Okay, now to pivot to the orchestral thing, and I do have a master's degree from Baylor University in orchestral conducting, and worked with a man named Stephen Hyde, who was, as I described earlier, an orchestra builder whose gift was day-to-day teaching. He was a fine string player himself. And so it wasn't so much about gesture, primarily about as much as it was understanding the score and relating to the orchestra. I worked with, some years later, privately with a man at University of Houston, Franz Krager, just a wonderful human being who had very, very fine pedagogical skills and stick technique. And so I studied privately with him for about a year. And he was a direct student of Elizabeth Green at University of Michigan. And so all of these sort of exercises that I do with conducting students came from Krager. Now, I think what you may be getting to, though, are the influences in the orchestral realm of people that I've observed. So, in any given conducting class, I might say, let's watch Claudio Abbado. Abbado, of course, was one of the great European conductors who did a fair amount of guest conducting in America, who had the most beautiful fluidity of gesture. So
amazing.
Amazing, and I think I have all the Beethoven symphonies with a camera directly on the conductor, which is fabulous, with Abbado.
Have you seen, I just watched the other day, I think he was doing, is it Mahler 9 that ends pianissimo? And he knew that this was probably his last performance because he was dying of stomach cancer. And it just gets slower and quieter and slower and quiet. And then when the music ends, I've never, some people almost make a gimmick out of this, but I've never seen someone do it so long. I mean, he took a solid 2 or 3 minutes to bring one hand in. And then another hand. There was at least 5 minutes of silence at the end. It was incredible.
Remarkable.
Yeah. Anyway, just
Yeah,
throwing that out because I was watching him the other day, and it was amazing.
Certainly, Abbado was one of, in my generation, in my lifetime, one of those whose, technical ability to get what he wanted and his physical facility was such that he could influence and shape the sound in remarkable ways. and then for other reasons, Riccardo Muti, I think, for the sort of fire and the just, I don't know, the technical precision and visceral command that Muti has is as a conductor. I suppose those are the two, conductors of orchestral conducting that for me are just the zenith.
Okay.
And then
Wow.
there are a number of really very gifted, sort of under age 50 conductors out there now. But I guess Abbado and Muti are sort of the two whom I have looked to for great role models.
One thing I love about Abbado is, I mean, I hate the from memory thing, like I'm not doing
Yeah.
stuff from memory, and he did
Yeah.
everything from memory. But the
Yes.
reason he did it is because he said he could communicate with people directly by just looking at them. And it seems like even though his hand gesture was, of course, impeccable, a
Right.
lot of what he did was he just smiled at people, or he
Yes.
would like give them the intensity through his eyes that they needed. And you can see it when you're watching, straight on him conducting. It's I don't think I've ever
Absolutely.
seen another orchestral conductor to that degree
Yeah.
of almost intimate connection with each member of the orchestra.
Yeah, I did several summers with the great German conductor, and he's still living, maybe age 91, 92, something like that. Helmut Rilling, a Bach specialist, as you
Of
know, from
course.
sort of the earlier generation, not a hip person, not a historical informed performance from the standpoint of using period instruments, but
Hmm.
primarily working with modern instruments, with a fabulous sense of Baroque style, but also deep theological understandings of the works of Bach. But what you were just getting at is this idea of conducting from memory, and when asked about this, he would always say something to the effect of, I don't want to be distracted by the score. I want to be able to look at the musicians, and so there is great power in eye-to-eye communication. Being able to look at people and not be disconnected by the score. One of my great pet peeves as a conducting teacher is, some conducting student will be preparing the ensemble, just about to give the first downbeat. And right at the moment when they're going to create the sound, the conductor looks down at the score in insecurity, right? It's like, and I use the analogy, it's like going in for the kiss, and just before the contact, you pull away, So I think for many of us in the conducting field, it's simply a matter of, we just look down much more than we have to. And so, if people want to get better and better at being connected to the singers, the musicians, whatever word you want to use, it's that discipline, obviously, on the front end of really understanding and knowing the score structurally, et cetera, and knowing that you can just look up, and if you miss a certain small detail, maybe that's less important in the moment than actually looking at the people. In the rehearsal, we all find ourselves looking down a lot because they're not looking up very much at us anyway in the beginning stages. And that's okay. Maybe they're looking up if they're skilled to say, is he going to breathe here? Okay, I got it. I mark it in, right? But if people are still sort of in the note process, learning process, they're not looking up constantly, but occasionally. The challenge, though, for the conductor then is to begin to make the transition from, I'm the rehearsal conductor who's looking down a fair amount, to I'm the performance conductor who's constantly connected to the musicians.
That's good to think of those in two different ways. Or, if you're in my situation, even in performance, you're not looking at them because you're playing the organ. So that's kind of a
Yes.
that's kind of a difficulty.
And I can't help
nice
you with console conducting. You'll have to do that session on your own.
Yeah. With that, it's just, you just try to get them as good as it's going to be, and then you breathe. And then
Right.
it's just everything is breath, at least in my experience.
Yes.
Everything is breath, and then breathing on the organ to show them,
There's a pro and con almost to everything. And I think the pro to what you have to do is you have the potential to build within the singer a certain level of independence, healthy, accountable independence that sometimes choral singers don't achieve because their conductor sort of spoon feeds every little thing. So that's the pro. And I suppose the downside is obviously your brain can't be 100% with the choir and 100% with the organ at any given moment. And there are nice little subtleties of things, like we talked about earlier, shaping a vowel or something that, your hands might be otherwise occupied. But,
They'll just
it
have
seems
to remember it,
right.
which is difficult. I have to ask, so it is remarkable. You are definitely not quiet about your faith, and you are at the University of North Texas, which is not exactly a historically Christian institution. It's definitely a landscape where there's a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different beliefs. You're probably the odd man out in a lot of ways, but I am, I'm not, the way I try to point to the faith is probably a little different, I would say, than the way that you point to the faith. And I'm not saying one is better or worse, It's like I'm always trying to find some historical precedent or some, philosophical thing or artistic thing, which you do as well, and then try to kind of weave the faith in there. So I have the benefit of the doubt. So, and it's like, what do you mean? I'm not just preaching the gospel, because everything I'm saying is totally relevant to the artistic, what you're
yes.
saying there. Sometimes you're even you're bolder than I would be. It's almost like you're giving an altar call every now and then. So
That's funny.
I think part of that is just maybe the traditions from which we come. But
Right.
how would you address that? And what is it like being trying to be an openly faithful Christian, also not trying to step on everybody's toes, and also being loving and inviting? I mean, what's the balance to you in the secular academic world?
Well, that's a beautiful question. Certainly, all of us who are professing Christians who work in really any area of the world, outside the church, we have to find, I think, our own way, and that's intuitive to who we are, and as you said, influenced by our respective journeys. So let me just contextualize a couple of things, and then you guide my response in a way that's helpful. So first, I would say that it's in a setting outside the church, inside the church as well, but anywhere with your family, etc. If one is not living out a Christ-like way of interacting with people to the best one can, day to day, knowing that we're all flawed, sinful human beings. If we don't meet people generally with a winsomeness, patience, with a kindness, all the verbalization of quoting scripture only has the potential to push people away as they see the incongruity of what we seem to profess with what we live out. Okay. So, I've often said it's much easier to name the 10 Commandments than to live them out. So the challenge of the Christian is to live out what they profess. Okay. And so we hope that what they profess is Orthodox Christianity, that which we find in Scripture and lived out in the life of Christ, teachings of Paul, etc. Now, more to your point, I don't choose to see the world bifurcated into this is my church world and this is my everything else in the world. I go into the grocery store and I speak to the person behind the counter, and I don't know that I speak to them altogether differently than I speak to my students at school or to the parishioners at my church. Not altogether different, right? So I think we want to have a consistency. Now, I know what you're getting to, and you're getting to the fact that in an academic institution, which is not in any way tethered to a Christian institution, which I taught
sometimes quite hostile to Christianity, if I may say so myself.
Yeah, and I think that it's, how do we separate the institution itself from the particular people with whom we interact day by day by day? Now, the institution is the people. That's true, right? But I don't think that I don't know that the institution sets out necessarily to be hostile. That's a whole nother show, isn't it? A whole nother conversation. So, I guess my responsibility primarily is to be the best musician I can be, and to be the best man I can be, to be the best person I can be consistently. Now, you worked with me enough to know that sometimes I'm impatient, and sometimes I'm blunt, and sometimes I'm not the easiest person to work with, but that's not the fault of my faith. That's my, being just a human being like anybody else. Um, I I'm compelled by many things. I'm compelled that as a vocal musician, the text is paramount, and we have to wrestle with what the text means. We have to wrestle with what the text means in 2025 when this interview is happening. We have to wrestle with what it meant in 17 whatever when J.S. Bach behind me was setting this text in a cantata. What did it mean in his world? And so I'm not afraid to wrestle with meaning, because I think it's implicit in the whole idea of what the university should be about, and that is to ask questions and to wrestle with meaning and to maybe not agree exactly on this or that. And so if you don't dig below the surface, you're not challenging your students to grow, you're not challenging yourself to grow, and the music itself will be benign as vocal music. It won't be compelling in that when we sing this big D major hallelujah, that it's in response to the text that just came before, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth, hallelujah, right? So meaning is at the core of it.
For sure. I mean, it sounds like a lot of your approach would be the somewhat the same, in that you can't sing a Bach cantata
Right.
that's all scripture
Yes.
and not talk about the scripture.
Exactly.
And all of the affect comes from his faith.
Yes.
Like he really believed what he wrote. It does annoy me somewhat when, people who are just totally secular do these great Bach works, but they seemingly have no connection with the text, and they're almost ashamed of it. I mean, I was in a performance of the Mozart Requiem, and the director said, "Now we don't really believe any of this anymore." This was at a church, by the way, and talking about, we don't really believe in the wrath of God or the judgment of God or any of these things. It's like, okay, but we need to be operatic with it. I'm like, you're kind of losing a lot of the point. It's like,
right.
Yes, you can be secular and you can perform the music, but you should at least totally understand the ethos and the pathos of the original composition.
Yeah, I think understanding is at the core of it. I also think, though, that for the artist, there has to be a willingness and a flexibility and a curiosity to go beyond one's set of life experiences. And here's what I mean by that. So let's say I'm a musical theater person and I'm a Christian who maybe doesn't even drink at all, right, by choice. And I'm tasked with playing a drunk in a scene in a musical. Well, either I don't take the gig because it violates some principle that I have, or I do the gig, but I'm an artist enough to play that role where the person is inebriated and it's not some compromise. I'm being an artist and I'm bringing that particular thing to life. You see a great Shakespearean play and someone is a murderer. Well, in real life, they're a very nice person who's never even thought about murdering someone. But as an actor, they've taken on the understanding, the psychology, the journey of that character, and they've portrayed it. So too in vocal music. Not everything that I conduct is my particular even version of Christianity, right? And so I have to sort of, as a maturing human, a maturing Christian, a maturing artist, what is of value in this repertoire? Is it worth putting in front of my choir? Does it inherently cause unnecessary angst and challenges within the group? I have to know what the group is. Is it worth, is the juice worth the squeeze musically? And, I find very, very, very rarely will anyone complain to me about the repertoire I put before them based on the text. There was an instance a few years ago where I had a student who brought something into a choir they were conducting, and there was a member of that choir who had a problem with the text. I won't go into any more detail. And so I had to sort of work through that, But coming back to your original idea about, living out one's faith in a secular environment, if you want to call it that, we were talking earlier about orchestral conductors. I've known of orchestral conductors, who were strong in their faith, and they went about doing their business and just being a good human and trying to be a good artist, and there wasn't so much of a problem. I think what we get to, though, is that we are dealing with text as choral musicians, and I think it's one of the things, the older I get, and this is a whole nother tangent of the more interested in the psychological work of Carl Jung I've become, and even in taking a simple thing like the Myers-Briggs test that many of us take to understand our personalities better, one of the things that resonates with me deeply is authenticity. Okay? And so I would rather be authentic to who I am as a conductor in the most winsome, gentle, sensitive way to the people around me than to try to put on a persona that is not me in order to somehow check a box with the people who are in front of me. First of all, we're assuming things on the part of the people in front of us that we have no idea, So I think a sense of authenticity is enormously important. And if for some reason we program texts that the people in front of us are challenged by, then this is a great learning opportunity. Maybe I remember as an undergraduate playing for a choir that sang the Holst hymns from the Rig Veda. And there was a young woman from a very conservative Christian background who had a problem with the text because it was from another faith. For the first time in my life, I understood how the agnostic person might feel about singing Christian text. I don't quite get it. It doesn't resonate with me. But then there's this, as an artist.
Would you sing the Holst hymns of the Rig Veda, or?
That's a good question. I'd have to go back and read the text more carefully. It's awfully wonderful music.
I struggle even listening, to be honest.
Okay.
There's some amazing Sufi music out there.
Yes.
But it's like I can only deal with so much because I feel like it's it's
at odds with your worldview in some way.
It's at odds with my faith, and I don't know. There even sometimes seems something rather inimical to some of it, even though even though I kind of dig it. There's some super complex Sufi music out there.
Yes.
And a little bit with North Indian classical music. It's like I'd be listening to some ragas and stuff, and I'll listen to it for a long time. I mean, I love some Indian classical music, but I do struggle when it's okay, but this is being used at a Hindu service. I'm not Hindu.
Right.
How much should I imbibe of this music? But whether we like it or not, we do live in the West. Right. Bach and Mozart and the requiems this is the great choral repertoire, and no one has to perform it, but it's not like that is the Western tradition if you're going to do the Western choral tradition, which has its own intrinsic value. But I'm curious about yourself when you're dealing with music of other faiths and other religions, how you navigate both listening and programming and participating.
Well, first of all, not avoiding your question, because I'm not given to do that. I would contextualize again, that conductors must wrestle with what's the mission of this choir. And so, the high school youth choir that I work with at my church has a different mission than the UNT a cappella choir has a different mission than the community choir with whom I worked, et cetera, right? And so the programming should be in every way about serving their mission and their needs educationally, musically, spiritually, et cetera. So all that said, my teacher, Don Nguyen, used to kind of put it this way. He says, we have an embarrassment of riches in the choral repertoire, in that whereas some mediums, the wind band medium, they have a couple hundred years maybe of repertoire, perhaps. I'm not sure. But, I mean, they can go back to Mozart, little works and that sort of thing. But when you think about the choral repertoire, I mean, we're talking about, from the medieval era onward, hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's never the problem that we don't have enough music from which to choose, is that we have too much music from which to choose to get the very, very best. And that is in some measure, I guess, in our era of time, the idea of absolutes is avoided by people. a lot, you know. And what I mean by that is to say that
Or
this
even
piece
generalizations, which is less than absolutes. You can't even
but
make a general statement anymore, but anyway.
some people would push back against the assertion that this man sitting behind me in the picture, J.S. Bach, that he was somehow a greater composer than other composers because of various factors. So I realize we live in that time in which we're wrestling with those kinds of questions. All that to say, if we have a stack of music that's this big, I have to consider three factors. I have to consider, in this stack of music that I could program with the choir, how much of this is best for the singers? And it brings it down to this much, right? So there's all this other music up here, which as a professional, I'm going to say it's a waste of time. It's just not that great of music, or the text is shallow. I'm not going to waste my choir's time with that music. So here's all the possibilities. And then one has to know one's audience, which is different, a congregation versus an audience paying to come hear you. Parents versus, you know, at a high-end university, it's a different audience. Okay, so now I've got to look at through this stack that's gotten smaller and say, what's my audience? Is this a tour? Is this a ecumenical gathering of churches? What is it? That brings it down to this amount of music. And then I've got to decide, okay, of that music, how much of this am I passionate about? And it brings it down to this. And then I make my choices. Because as a conductor, I'm not going to program music that I'm not passionate about to check a box for someone else. But I have to consider
Nor do I think should you.
No. I have to consider the singer's best interest and the audience to some degree, and then my own. And then this becomes the body of literature that I choose. Now, I tend to think about things as in my academic setting as to what is the long-term impact on the people entrusted to me for this semester, this year, these series of years. And if I'm to be a music teacher, then my goal is to make them better musicians when they leave than when they started with me. I think I alluded earlier in our conversation about a young woman who sent me just a lovely note and talked about now that she's singing in semi-pro and professional choirs, how much better she is at certain skill sets because of the expectations that I brought to rehearsal day by day by day and would not compromise on. And it's not just that I have a high expectation of the musical rendering, which, you know, our first obligation is to honoring the composer. But then secondly, the people we're serving there in the rehearsal and in the performance, in an academic setting, you know, at some point we want them to go out and be great musicians, the best they can be. So we're imparting to them these skill sets. Part of that process is putting in front of them the music of the greatest craftsmanship that we can muster that's appropriate for their skill set at the time, right? So on in any given program with UNT a cappella choir, or when I conducted the Luther College Nordic Choir or Sam Houston State Chorale, whatever, you know, I have to consider a banquet of repertoire over the course of the year. I mean, I'm not going to do a whole year of Renaissance slow motets with an academic choir that needs to exercise more muscles than just this one, right? So there's an academic obligation. And so I have to challenge myself to be as broad as I can in my musical understandings and tastes to meet the academic needs of the singers in front of me, okay? So that they're better musicians. And I'm going to choose by my own, you know, going from this repertoire to this amount of repertoire to this amount of repertoire. I'm going to tend to gravitate towards certain composers like any honest musician does in any medium, right? The great pianists, there are going to be some who played Schubert better than others. I mean, we lost Alfred Brendel in the last year, who played Schubert maybe better than anyone else. Certain pianists who play Mozart, certain pianists who play Chopin better than others. Why should we apologize for that? And so I have to look through the eyes of the needs of my singers, particularly in an academic setting. But then I have to say, maybe I do Brahms a little better than other people do. Some other people do. So why shouldn't I sing a little more Brahms than some conductors, right? That's
well, naturally, like, just if your faith influences your taste and your aesthetics,
yes,
and then because of that, you as a musician, you listen to way more Bach than you listen to anybody else.
okay,
then it just makes sense that Bach is who you are. So then
it's
you
true.
would do more Bach
Yes,
just out of that. So I mean, there's sort of a holistic approach, you know, or way of rendering how you come to those decisions. So
There is, and you know, probably more than the average 19-year-old. I'm thinking lifespan. In other words, what I mean by that is you as an organist can identify someone with whom you want to go study French repertoire, French romantic repertoire, versus someone you might want to go study Bach with, versus other genres of organ repertoire, because we all, because of our journey, have certain strengths. And so, you know, when I think about my experiences with these different conductors whom I've named, I've gotten different things from them. And so why in academia, of all places, should we try to sort of sterilize everybody down to doing the same body of repertoire, even with choirs, when there are people who do spirituals better, some people who do Bach better, some people, etc., right? And so why can't we be open-minded enough to say, okay, I'm going to go sing with so-and-so, and from them, I'm going to figure out what can I really get that I couldn't get from almost anyone else.
now I really would love to know if you would do that, the Holst, the ragas piece.
I'm happy to try to address that, yeah. So the Holst of which we were speaking, the hymns that were debated, number one, I almost never conduct treble choirs. It's just not, you know, I conduct mostly SATB choirs and symphonic repertoire and early music. So in my whole career, I've never been sitting at a table and said, do I do this piece because of its text or not? I think that in an academic setting, if it either complemented the theme of the concert, like maybe you're doing, I don't know, you know, representation of world faiths, let's say, or world cultures.
Or you could do creation, and you could do almost all Christian stuff, but there's for sure some Hindu stuff out there, some Jainist stuff, some Buddha, you know, whatever.
Yes. So I don't think I would shy away from that. I don't. Again, I haven't had occasion to do that, to program it. And I am mindful, again, of what words I put into the mouths of the singers, because, you know, they don't really get a lot of choice, is what we put in front of them. If I'm to be consistent with my academic convictions, which is to say the best repertoire as best I can discern in my journey and experience, part of that is going beyond the Christian idiom, without question. And so I wouldn't put words in people's mouths that I thought were going to create a great stir. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you do that? But knowing your people and knowing your situation, I would think that if I were conducting a fine women's choir and I wanted to do those Holst pieces and they fit into the thematic, the musical balance of fast and slow and keys and textures and all that, I don't think I would have a problem with programming it, no. Nor do I think that doesn't compromise my Christian faith, I don't think.
Would you be hesitant about doing, you know, a lot of Marian stuff?
No.
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't. Because the context of what I'm called to do in the classroom.
Because I know you're more of a Baptist, you know.
Well,
so,
right? I mean, that's
so I don't know. I guess I don't know how you feel about, you know, the veneration of Mary, but I'm just kind of assuming.
Well,
it's a little taboo for a evangelical.
That's okay. No. And certainly in my own reading of Scripture, in my own journey and evolution of theological conviction, that is my own. That is my own. And to, you know, if I were to say to myself, so I'm not going to program any choral repertoire with in my academic settings that may have a more Catholic origin to it, I would be limiting a vast amount of unbelievably good repertoire, right? And so, you know, in the same way that I'm asking the agnostic or the atheist person to sing a text of Christian text, you know, I can't be completely black or white in that. And so, no, I don't have a problem with that. And yes, I was sort of raised in the Baptist tradition in a small Texas town, and so that was
not trying to put you in a corner there.
No. But certainly my own understanding and reading of Scripture and my worldview and all of that evolves, as I hope it does for any of us. And by evolve, I mean deepens based on the sources, Scripture, you know.
Being open, you know, with your faith, have you had any any experience is really either super positive or super negative if you're willing to go there in the
Yeah.
academic setting. Like, what's been the challenges of it? And then have you seen some like major fruit? Someone who was agnostic who said, I sang this Howells and I was convinced, and now I'm attending a church. I'm
That's
sure over the course of your
yeah,
career you've
35
seen
years.
probably both.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I thank you for asking that. And maybe it'll make the final cut. We'll see. So I would say on the positive side, um, there will be students who will occasionally self-identify of, I'm a Christian too, and that they were greatly encouraged by my being open about my faith. This happens most often when I'm on the road and guest conducting an all-state choir or something. And so you have, not a choir that sings together all the time, but maybe 200 kids from all over the state. And maybe I will stop and talk about aspects of my values that are, in no way controversial. That I'll talk about my love for my children, how important it is to me to be a good father, those kinds of things, right? That aren't limited necessarily to a specific Christian tradition, but are just human values of the highest order. And then, like you've talked about earlier in our conversation about unpacking the meaning of text, that certainly on a program, a concert of any all-state kind of choir, there are going to be some pieces that are historically sacred text. And so I'm not afraid to in an intellectual way talk about. So we see here that this line is ascending, and this Kyrie. What do you think that means? Oh, maybe that person is talking to God. Yes. And then they sing that musical line in a different way. So I haven't superimposed my Christian beliefs on someone. I have drawn forth meaning that I've seen in the text by tapping into the creativity and the observations of students. And one person I haven't mentioned in our conversation is Weston Noble, who was at Luther College before I was for, he had the choir 57 years. And he was brilliant at asking questions of the people in front of him to get them both engaged and to get the conversation about meaning started, right? So it's not me superimposing, but it's getting people thinking about why at this key change is this word, and what does that mean? And then all of a sudden, people sing with a different understanding, right? So I find that there are kind of sneaky ways to get people to wrestle with meaning that aren't me imposing. So, but other times I'm a little bit more obvious about my faith. But I always want to present it within the context of a choir's rehearsal in a way that is uplifting. Even working with an orchestra to say, not that we want to talk them to death, because that's one of the things choir conductors are always accused of, but to say, this is literally the sun rising as we play this 8 bars in Haydn creation, right? And they're going to play it with a little bit more intensity. Now, I didn't give them chapter and verse. I just said, this is indeed the sun rising. And so that scale is going to have a different import, right? On the negative side, and I'll try to make the negative positive, okay? I remember years ago, there was a young man who was not a music major, but a brilliant physics major who was singing in my choir, college choir, and he was not a person who had embraced the Christian faith. So I would guess, agnostic would be, I guess, the word to use. I'm not even sure what that really means, to be candid with you, but he didn't value a traditional sense of faith. And one day I was rehearsing a piece, and in his very sincere way, he saw me for a moment after the rehearsal, and he said, Hightower, and he just called me Hightower, when you talk about all this Jesus and God and all that stuff, it just really doesn't do anything for me. And that sort of bruised me just gently, but I was like, called him by name, thank you. That honesty is really helpful to me, and I appreciate that. And I began to think a little bit more about my role and the incumbency of a conductor to engage people who don't necessarily share the same faith belief. And so I remember I was rehearsing this wonderful piece by Oyelo, It was a setting of the Sanctus text. And it began to gently, slowly, gradually build into this Sanctus, holy, 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 right? But it began very quietly and brooding. And in a moment, and this is part of the gifting of my brain that dashes all around that some people don't quite understand why I think the way that I do. But in the darting of my brain, all of a sudden I remembered from childhood, and I stopped the rehearsal and I told a story, and I said, I remember in childhood watching on PBS Dr. Carl Sagan, and he would talk about the billions and billions of stars in the galaxy. And I said, do you hear over these 8 measures how this gradual crescendo and explosion, this is like the birth of a star. Bah! And I looked back at that young man, and he was going. And he saw me after class, and he said, you know, Dr. Hightower, that's the first time I've ever connected to that piece. And it changed me pedagogically. In no way did I compromise my Christian faith or minimize my understanding of the scriptural description of the holiness of God, the 3 times, the thrice holy God. But it helped me to bridge the musical intention of that composer and his response to the text, setting of the text, to the lived experience of that singer. And so it made me a better teacher. So that's my story.
Good. No, I think anyone could relate to that. That's not all that controversial.
Not at all. A Star is Born. Yeah.
Yeah. But you've I guess dealt with no like official reprimand from any administration for anything like that?
I don't think so. You know, in the earlier years of teaching, I was a little bit more consistent in reading the student evaluations that students are asked to give at the end of semester. I remember one of my former professors saying, well, when you've conducted a college choir for 35 years, then you can evaluate my work. Now, I don't have quite that snarky of an attitude, but I think with maturity and experience, have the ability to contextualize, okay, this 19-year-old's journey thus far, I can understand their perspective. And it's not one that I share necessarily at my own age. And I appreciate the feedback, and I will consider it appropriately. But it's not going to knock me to my, to the floor with, oh my word, I may have accidentally slightly offended someone with this or that. Right? It has to be in context. And the mission, my mission in the academic setting is to grow musicians and to give people, mountaintop musical experiences. So with that as being that's at the core of the mission, there are going to be times that any conductor is going to step on toes, either step on toes with some opinion or some interpretation, or with a lack of something, a lack of musicianship, a lack of whatever. So probably in some student evaluations over the years, there have been some people probably who've said this or that about me being maybe a little more demonstrative about aspects of faith. I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it at all.
It seems like you can make the argument that, that really your highest priority goal in the academic setting is to give academic excellence.
Yes.
But I think there's a presuppositional issue with that,
Yes.
right? Not that's sort of imposed upon us in this secular dichotomizing between like our religious faith, how we map everything onto the world, and the secular life. Because you could make the argument like, well, it's really academic excellence that I'm seeking after most.
Right.
But for the Christian, the whole reason that you're seeking academic excellence is because all truth ultimately points up to the high truth.
Yes.
So then you can make the argument, well, you can try to take that away from me, that it should just be a purely secular academic venture. But that's a prima facie logical impossibility, because insofar as I have academic continuity or academic expertise and striving, that only comes from my belief about the highest truth, insofar as my academic consistency is ultimately pointing to the transcendent, to God himself.
Well, you said that so beautifully. In a former institution, I had many friends in academic disciplines like biology and chemistry and physics with whom I was in a Christian circle, who were very faithful. And their motivation obviously was not somehow to take biology and, try to make it fit their reading of scripture. Okay, primarily. So let me say, so no, I'm with you. I think I'm with you 100% in saying that, my life ambition, which has much more to do with my teaching, or much more to do than with my artistry, any of that, that my life goal is to glorify God, is to know him, is to make him known, and is to glorify God. And I fall short of all those things daily, but that doesn't mean that that's not my driving ambition and my driving goal. And the reason for which I was created, the reason for which I was redeemed, is to give glory to God. And so the person who's teaching in the biology class or in the physics class, their subject matter is a little different, and it's not quite as overtly dealing with texts like we do in choral music. On the other hand, how wonderful for a biologist to be able to, without judgment, make reference to the extraordinary way in which God created the human eyeball, which is far more complex than anything man has ever created. Why not? Why not?
Sure.
But I want to go back to the very beginning of this conversation about faith and about our work. And that is to say, when I beat myself up at the end of the day, it's rarely about, did I turn the phrase beautifully or not? Did I get that chord in tune or not? Did I cite the right book from which this, idea came? It's usually, did I treat people with dignity? Did I speak too shortly with that person? Did I make a comment that I thought in jest would be funny, but maybe that's a sore spot with that person? It's usually those kinds of things that I have to repent of, and that I have to think about, how can I be just a more loving individual, which is not always the easiest thing for a conductor. Because we have to take a group of people who all have different ideas and opinions, and take them together from here to there, right? And that's why some conductors you love to sing and play for. I remember when I lived in Los Angeles as a grad student, and I went to a rehearsal of Sir Simon Rattle at the very top of the profession, right? And he was guest conducting the LA Phil, and he was working with a couple of solo singers. My wife was one of those in that particular setting. And he was just so chill and just so kind and wonderful. And that, back to another question, because he knew how to get what he wanted by being specific, he didn't have to be short with anyone.
Yeah, I don't have time anymore for people that are short with me. I just, I've had too much stress the last decade of my life, and now that I have kids, there's enough stress inherent in having kids. I don't need any more stress. If I'm working with a conductor and they stress me out, it's like, I'm one and done. I don't care.
That's right. A musician with whom I work on a weekly basis in another setting outside of school said there's kind of a tripod of things that he considers when he's going to take a gig or not. He's a trumpet player. And he said, do I like the people that I'm going to work with? That would include the conductor. Do I like the music we're going to play? And does it pay well enough, right? Those three considerations any jobbing musician would consider. And there's a time in our life when we need the money so bad we might play for things we wouldn't want to. But at some stage,
that equation can shift, and sometimes you just love the person and love the music, and it doesn't matter if it pays.
That's so very true. That's so very true. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sometimes you need the money.
And that's why, times I've paid to go sing with someone in the summers, to go sing with Robert Shaw at Westminster Choir College for 2 weeks, to go sing with Joe Flummerfeld, to go sing with someone whom I knew that I would be better because of the time. Yeah.
So what is there left to be accomplished?
Well, that's a great question.
What big goal is hanging out there over the head of Alan Hightower that You must do.
I think that a sense of being driven at a certain stage in a person's life as an artist is pretty crucial. If your goal and your gifting and your vocation, we haven't talked much about vocation, but your calling is to be the best tenor on Broadway. And I have a friend here in the Dallas area who, sang Phantom and Phantom of the Opera for years, and he's a great Christian gentleman. And I bet if he were here talking with us, he would say, yes, but I heard no, and no, and no, and no, and no, and then I got this bit part in this other show, and then somebody heard me and they said, why don't you audition for Phantom? I don't know his story exactly, but I think this is the journey of all artistic people. And I hear stories about people who, they had one job their whole career, or they never applied for a job and people kept asking them. And there are those few people. Most of us apply for a job and don't get it, and we learn from that, and we apply for another job and we make the finals and we don't get it, and then finally something clicks. And as a person of faith, I happen to think that God is in all of that and closes lots of doors, right? Okay, so all that said, I think if you're going to be an artist, a musician, you've got to have a feistiness in you that says, I'm not going to take a detour the first time I hear no. Because I'm going to, and I'm very honest with the singers at school, at a place like University of North Texas, which has so many extraordinarily gifted singers, right? But you're going to hear no. And then I can contextualize that, as I just did for you, to say, but I believe that there's a higher power at work in this. And sometimes that no is a greater yes. So I know that jobs I haven't gotten that led to me getting jobs that I eventually got, that if I'd gotten that first job, I wouldn't have been available for the second. So the sort of reformed Christian in me sees God at work in all of these things. Okay, now back to your question about what's left for Alan Hightower. So I have been very fortunate to have great opportunities to have wonderful choirs and to sing abroad and to compete in international competition and just have multiple choirs sing at national American Choral Directors, ACDA conferences, and those sort of things. Gotten to do a lot of great choral orchestral repertoire and work with fine orchestras. So what's left for me? Me personally, I think it's about repertoire. I think it's about repertoire, and I think it's about the possibility, as we've seen John Elliott Gardner reinvent himself in recent years. He had this one sort of set of ensembles, and then that chapter ended. And now he's actually starting something new called Constellation. You might enjoy looking into.
Sure.
I think for me, there are certain repertoires that I haven't conducted, or I haven't conducted as much as I want to. Okay, and for me, those are the great choral orchestral things, the big works of Bach, and I'd love to do more Haydn creations and more Brahms requiems and more of the cantatas of Bach and that sort of thing. And I say that with no apology, because in any academic realm, the people who we know and respect are the people who learn more and more about less and less. Right? The person on CNN getting interviewed about the tsetse fly or whatever, I'm making up something absurd, is the person who knows more about that one subject than anyone else. And that's why they're on the national news, right? So I want to know more and more and go more and more deeply into this particular body of choral orchestral repertoire. And I've had conversations and I'm toying with the possibility of founding my own professional choir and orchestra that would focus on sacred works primarily for choral and for choir and orchestra, sort of in this time span of 1600 to through 1900. That's kind of the
okay.
And maybe a bit more, maybe up to sort of up to 1900, 1600 to 1900 would be.
So not necessarily like the Mahler like the choral
maybe
Mahler
not.
symphonies. Okay.
Maybe not. So we'll see. We'll see if something comes of that. But certainly in the academic setting, I just want to do the best repertoire I can, and to do it better and better, and to go more deeply with it. And certainly open to other repertoires. But I'm in an academic setting in which I have colleagues who have other expertise, and other repertoires, even within the choral genre, and colleagues who are better at certain things than what I do, or have an interest in things that I have intrinsically perhaps a little less interest in. So I'd rather do the thing I do pretty well, better and better. Yep.
Yeah, that's good. I've for the entirety of my adult life, I've noticed that I've had big goals,
Yes.
and I always think that when I get to the end of these goals, I'll be happier. If I can just learn this many etudes, and I can just have this good piano technique, and then it's like, well, if I could just have a lesson with this guy, and I could play these organs, and if I could
Right.
just live in Europe, and I've I've kind of come to the conclusion, and maybe it's just having kids and growing older, but now I have a list of goals on my phone, but at the top of the list,
Yes.
I put goals. These will not make me happy.
Hmm.
Just to remind myself, because I want to look at the list
Yes.
and know where I'm at. And I got to be reminded these ultimately aren't going to make me happy. And I also think, like, this was a moment I had on vacation, like a couple weeks ago, where I always think of what the perfect day is or what the perfect week is.
Oh.
You can think of, as like Peterson would say, it's always good to have a heaven and a hell. Good to think 5 years from now, what's my heaven? What could
Yes.
my life look like? And 5 years from now, what's my hell? If I just give in to all my passions, meaning the bad passions,
Right. Right. Right.
what could my life look like? And so I think
Yes.
of the same for a day or the same for a week. And sometimes it's super useful because then it can help me think, okay, well, that means that generally I want to practice a couple hours every day, or maybe 4
Right.
hours, or during a course of a week, I would like to get so many hours of practice and so much exercise, and it's not a bad thing. But then we were on vacation, and I had like 5 hours of sleep, and the girls got up early, and I think one of the girls might have just like thrown up or something, and my toe was blistered from hiking too much the day before, and my hip really hurt for some reason because I got a little bit of sciatica. It's like I don't remember the exact you know
Yes.
conglomeration of all the things that were going on, but it was simultaneously a great time because I was spending it with them, and I was also a little bit miserable. And I was thinking about what a perfect day would be, and then it's almost as though I heard a voice that just kind of reminded me, whether it was my intuition or God moving my intuition or however,
Yes.
that said, this is a perfect day,
Hmm.
you know? And one day you're going to look back and you're going to think, man, why didn't I just enjoy that day despite the sciatica and the blister on my toe that I had when my
Yes.
girl was 3, you know?
Yes.
And so I'm trying to both live into the working really hard and also it doesn't matter. It's not going to fulfill me. Love the day that's given to me, and it's not going to be any more perfect,
Well, that's what you've just said in the last 4 minutes is really profound, and I agree with it completely. So often on social media, I'll see someone in your age of life with young children, and my comment will be something like, "This is the best of life," right? To be loved by people that you love, and to spend time with them. This is the best of this side of heaven, I should think. And so, yeah, I think there is this balance that's hard to find. I mean, I'm often asked about life slash work balance, and I don't think I'm very good at it. But
You are a very driven person.
I'm a driven person. And there's probably a lot of psychology behind that I've never fully explored, but Carl Jung is helping me understand a little bit of it. But um, I've also been very blessed that I've been married happily for 28 years, and I have a wonderful wife, as do you, and I have 2 teenage daughters who are great human beings, and we're all flawed people, but that aspect of life is very rich for me. I know it's rich for you, and so I think for the working musician, there's this constancy of, like a book I read in undergraduate as a pianist that said, I really should be practicing. There's always that gnawing in the back of us since childhood. I really should be practicing. But I think there's this constancy, like you talked about, a checklist of goals, sort of overarching life goals. Certain things are not going to make me happier, but certain things are going to enrich me, certainly. And so for me, the discipline of trying to read scripture every day, I know that when I take the time, even if it's just, a psalm as I'm hurrying out the door, I'm going to be better because I did that. It's not checking the box. It's for my own good, for heaven's sakes, Um, so I think it's a struggle. I don't think, in the same way that I don't think there are 10 easy steps to anything worthwhile in the arts, right? There are no 10 easy steps. It's all hard work. And it's not a trajectory that does this. It's a trajectory that does this. That's the life of the artist, the life of the musician. I think you have to establish certain boundaries, and you're going to step out of them sometime, and you have to have grace for yourself. But I think there is a dichotomy for persons like myself in that my calling, my vocation is complex. I'm called to academia. I was created with a mind and a passion that suits that, and I'm called to the local church because I love God's people and I want to serve Him in that capacity. And I'm called to be a husband and a father. And sometimes I'm a little bit better at one than the other. And, we ask for grace and try to do the best we can. But there'll come a time when we will look back on our lives, and we hope that we have apportioned those things in a way that number one, honored and glorified God, and then that enriched the people that were entrusted to us, both in our work life and in our family life, and that let us be true to who we are, So I think if I had a spouse, and I certainly did not, but if I'd had a spouse that said, you could make a lot more money, I want you to go to medical school or something instead and give up music. Number one, that individual would not have really understood me or loved me if they'd asked that of me, to not be a musician. But I have to be true to myself, that I have to fulfill that part, that vacuum that God put in me, And obviously, with that terminology, I'm alluding to the God-shaped vacuum that nothing else can fulfill, right? And we know that as believers, that we can try to fill it with addictions and with work and with all kinds of things that don't fill that. But I think God made us in a complex sort of way. Even going back to the garden, even before the fall of man, Adam had work to do,
Mm.
And
Yeah, I think the danger is a lot of the artistic community, especially sort of post Beethoven. I don't think Bach lived this.
okay,
The romantic ideal of the artist, I think, is different. I think it's take your passions and pursue them with everything that you have. And sometimes we even idolize those people who they're maybe this is a little critical of Bernstein, but I watched the recent movie of Bernstein. It's like to the detriment of his family, he was he was like the best musician in the world, And sometimes we even idolize they were the best at this one thing.
right.
And I think that's the romantic, modern, secular ideal. And not even putting it in a Christian ideal. I think but I think Christianity adopted this ultimately. I think if you put it in the Stoic ideal or the Marcus Aurelius ideal, it's not pursue your passions to where they go. It's what is your duty? Did that man live up to his duties?
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
What is your duty?
And I think, like for Marcus Aurelius, the Marcus Aurelius looking at Matthew Wilkinson or looking at Alan Hightower would take those 4 quadrants or however many quadrants there are of the identity and say,
right.
did you fulfill your duty in each of those areas? Rather than did you pursue each passion in the way it was supposed to be? Is like, no, were you the best academic? Were you the academic you were called to be and the musician, but also the father and the husband? It's like, was I the church musician and did I pursue God? Did I, but it's a different framework. You know,
Yes.
did I do my duty in each of those areas? And that's the only thing that I can look back on my deathbed and ask the question, because the circumstances change, but
Yes.
you still have a duty, you know? So anyway, that's sort of the way I think about it at the moment.
No, I think that's beautifully said. And I would hope as an old man, I don't consider myself an old man yet, but as an old man, should God give me long years, to have very little regret. And heretofore, I have very little regret. I mean, times when I should have been more present with my family, probably, like not just physically present, but like engaged, you know, times of that. But even when the girls were little and someone would have a ballet recital or whatever, I was there. You know, we
It's
we
beautiful.
we make the choice. We make the choice. But I love Marcus Aurelius. What is my duty? And I love that idea of quadrants. And I think again, as long as we give ourselves grace to know that on every day, I'm not going to check every box perfectly, but in the arc of life, I'm going to strive to do so.
Yeah, I think it's a little mini hell if you look back and you regret big swaths of your life. It's like, it's you can extrapolate the pattern of Judgment Day
Yes.
and it's like, even if you didn't believe in a metaphysical hell, you
Yes.
can't deny that there is the pattern of hell. Like,
Right.
on your deathbed, no matter what, whether you're atheist or you're Christian, there's Judgment Day. And that Judgment Day does look at everything that you've ever said and done, every word that you've ever spoken. And
Yes.
it's like, even your regrets are some micro instantiation of hell on Judgment Day. You know, it's like that. Of course, like the medieval Christians and like antiquity believed in the ultimate metaphysical heaven and hell, because the
Yes.
pattern itself is so radically true for quotidian existence, for everyday
Mm,
life. You can just
yes.
see it every day. So it's almost, I think, to an ancient mindset that's not taking everything in material terms, it would be patently absurd not to believe in these polarities of existence, because you can just see them every day. Anyway, I'm
Without
going
question.
on
No, no, no.
random
No,
rants here. Sorry.
it's a beautiful rabbit trail. I guess, and we're probably heading toward a finale here. I am to a place in life, and this is very much growing out of, I think, where you're going with these things. Coming to a place in life, as I said, where I have very few regrets, some, but very few. But I'm able to see in peers, people my own age, in my own profession, who maybe aren't finishing well. Who maybe have made some personal decisions or have chosen to lean so much into their career over their family life that there will be significant regrets. And to parallel that with the concept of hell, and I am, I mean, Jesus talked as much about hell as he did about heaven, and so I can't imagine why we wouldn't, if we're true to Scripture, I can't imagine why we would not believe that there is both the possibility of eternally being in God's presence and eternally being outside of God's presence. And that in itself, whatever the descriptors, whatever the medieval descriptions of fire, etc., that there is a separation, that there is a potential separation from God. I mean, I think if you call yourself a Christian, then you're tethered to the Bible, and the Bible is so very clear about that. I mean, Jesus talks about it constantly. All that to
Well, he
say,
definitely talks about hell, and not to get into theological minutia, but just
yeah,
a very interesting point. There is
yes,
like an Eastern concept that hell is not the separation of God.
okay,
This is an Orthodox concept, but that
yes,
that metaphysically, ontologically, there's only the love of God. But
okay,
therefore, the love of God to those who have received him is
yes,
paradise everlasting. And
okay,
the love of God to those who have rejected him is
yes,
an ever-consuming fire. And that can at least map onto even that same experience of regret,
yes,
because as you're looking back, it's those loves that you have abandoned, and it's the pain of that love that you have not accepted. It's, I did not love my family the way I should. I did not
Yes.
love my church. I did not love my my church choir the way that I should. And so
Yes.
it's the pain of the love that actually creates the regret. So you can see in the small instantiation of that pattern. So then they would
Yes.
say, it's actually the experience of the love of God to those who have explicitly rejected it that is the consuming fire of hell, which is sort of a different metaphysical understanding than its separation from God, because they'd say, how can you ever be separated from He who is everywhere?
Ah, there's beautiful nuance and depth to that, and this is why well-meaning people, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, still wrestle with aspects of Scripture.
Not to get way into all the theological minutia, it's too interesting of a point that I thought you would find interesting that I couldn't not mention. But
I certainly do. But I think my own career and my own life journey has been marked by I want to honor God. God has shown me tremendous grace, a word we haven't talked about in this whole time, grace, and mercy, and has allowed me to live a professional life, which has been on the whole very fulfilling and very motivating, and to come to a place in life where you love it because you love it and not because somehow it defines you or gives you a better self-esteem, whatever all that is, but because it's fulfilling in just doing the thing, whether that's the teaching, whether that's the making of the music, that the doing of the thing itself is so fulfilling that it doesn't have to prop me up, right? Because that's a whole nother psychological thing that is, someone else who's had some training will have to speak to that. So I remember what it was like to be a high school freshman and singing in the adult church choir and us singing Messiah and just loving it because it was so beautiful and it was so complicated to me. And, and it just deep calls unto deep, that sort of thing. And the fact that I do it for a living, hopefully doesn't take the joy out of it or create of it an idol. Music is a beautiful vocation and profession. It's a terrible idol, isn't it? And it can certainly become that. So, I think if we can find the best in this life, which is to have a sincere faith, which is rooted in an understanding of the grace of God and His pursuit of us, then there's a lot of pressure that's taken off of us to live every moment in perfection, which is impossible. I think a healthy approach to that, and those of us who are fortunate enough to have a life mate that we can love and respect, that's a beautiful thing. And those of us who are blessed to have children, that's an incredibly deepening thing. And then to have a life of work, a body of work that's meaningful. I'm very grateful for that.
There doesn't seem much better to have all of that.
We're very blessed persons, aren't we? It's been great to talk to you, Matt. It's been great.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you as well. Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for coming on and talk to me. Perhaps we'll do it again sometime.
Let's do. Blessings on you.